Agatha Christie is most famous for her stories featuring her two famous detectives, Poirot and Miss Marple. But a large number of her novels were standalone stories, featuring protagonists who usually only ever appeared once. This is the case with the Sittaford Mystery, also titled The Murder at Hazelmoor, which was first published in 1931 and adapted for TV in 2006. A couple videos ago, we found out that you can change a lot when adapting a story from book to screen, and it can still count as an adaptation. This begs the question, just how far can you go? As usual, a spoiler warning is in effect for both book and film. The book begins by introducing Captain Trevelyan, a retired Navy officer who lives in the village of Sittaford. He loves money, competition, and athleticism, and has no interest in women. He has a close friend and neighbor, Major Burnaby. One winter, he rents his house out to a pair of women, Mrs. Willett and her daughter Violet. One night, the Willets invite Major Burnaby and a few other guests over. They decide to do some table turning, a type of seance. It's all fun and games until apparently a spirit reports that Captain Trevelyan has been murdered. Everyone agrees it must be a joke, but Major Burnaby insists on going to Exhampton, the town where Trevelyan is staying, to check on his friend, even though this means he has to walk 2 whole hours through heavy snow. His efforts result in the discovery that Trevelyan's house has been broken into, and the captain has indeed been murdered, bludgeoned to death. The investigation is headed by Inspector Narracott. Major Burnaby swears he doesn't believe in the spirit world, even though that's what prompted him to check on Trevelyan. Narracott is more interested in why the Willets wanted to rent Sittaford House, and the fact that in his will, Trevelyan left £90,000 to his living relatives. Also investigating the murder is eager young reporter Charles Enderby, who uses delivering a prize to Major Burnaby for mailing in the correct solution to a newspaper competition as an excuse to interview him. Inspector Narracott discovers that Trevelyan's nephew, James Pearson, saw his uncle on the day of the murder. When James acts suspiciously, Narracott detains him. And here's where we meet our protagonist, Emily Trefusis, who vows to find the real killer and prove that James, her fiancé, is innocent. Okay, now the adaptation. Just bear with me. As in the book, we're introduced to Captain Trevelyan in Egypt. Then we fast forward a couple decades, and it looks like Trevelyan is about to become Prime Minister. Because why not? In the book, Trevelyan's manservant, sister, brother-in-law, niece, and 2 nephews are all suspects, but they're all left out of the adaptation except James, who accuses Trevelyan of sending a letter threatening to disinherit him. Trevelyan denies sending it. Then we meet our protagonist, Miss Marple. That's right, continuing the tradition started by Margaret Rutherford in the 1960s, Miss Marple becomes the star of yet another Agatha Christie story in which she did not originally appear. She meets Trevelyan on a train and ends up staying as a guest at Sittaford House. Emily Trefusis is still in the story, and it turns out she's the ex-fiancé of Miss Marple's nephew. Honestly, they pack in so many details it's hard to keep track of everything. The next noteworthy change occurs when we meet Major Burnaby and Charles Enderby, except they've switched names, so in the film we have Major Enderby and Charles Burnaby. I wonder why they did that. The Major acts as Trevelyan's secretary/political agent, and Charles approaches Emily, who forces him to admit he's after an interview with Trevelyan. The next part of the film gathers Trevelyan, James, and a bunch of other characters at the 3 Crowns Hotel, which was mentioned briefly in the book. Violet and her mother are there as guests, and Mr. Kirkwood is changed from Trevelyan's lawyer to the hotel manager. They mention an escaped convict, which does also happen in the book. We just haven't gotten to that yet. Bond. James Bond. In the film, the seance happens at the 3 Crowns, so James and Trevelyan both participate, but the Major isn't there. The Ouija board predicts Trevelyan's death, but later on James confesses to faking the message. Back at Sittaford House, the Major's pet hawk is poisoned by a box of candy that was meant for Trevelyan. This is what prompts the Major to make the long hike through the snow in an effort to warn his friend that someone is trying to kill him. Shortly afterward, Charles follows the Major, leaving Emily in the house with Miss Marple. Charles and the Major arrive at the 3 Crowns and discover Trevelyan, stabbed to death. Let's see, did I miss anything? Oh yeah, they added a ghost. Don't blink. Back to the book. Charles and Emily team up to solve the murder. Charles, who is smitten with Emily, pretends to be her cousin. Anyone familiar with Agatha Christie's work might think Emily or James or both killed Trevelyan, and now she's setting up Charles to take the fall. The amateurs meet Trevelyan's neighbors, including Miss Percehouse and her nephew Ronald Garfield, both of whom are in the adaptation, though in name only. For instance, Ronald in the book is a very young man who's crushing on Violet. While they're investigating, a convict escapes from a local prison, and Emily overhears Mrs. Willett mention something happening tonight. Since Mrs. Willett has just fired all the servants, Emily suspects something important is going to happen at Sittaford, so she puts Charles on stakeout duty. At midnight, Charles sees one of the Willett women leave the house to meet a man out in the snow. It's hinted that it's the convict, but actually it turns out to be Brian Pearson, James's brother. Violet and Brian are secret lovers, and they conspired with Mrs. Willett to rent Sittaford House from Brian's uncle because of its proximity to the prison. The convict on the loose is actually Mr. Willett, Violet's father, whom they wanted to help escape. However, the man gets lost, is recaptured by the police, and dies from pneumonia. With that red herring out of the way, Emily keeps investigating, and she discovers a certain pair of boots hidden up a chimney. From this, she deduces the identity of the killer. Meanwhile, in the film, Inspector Narracott doesn't appear at all because the police can't get through the snow. Major Enderby takes charge of the investigation, and Charles and Emily act as his assistants, again with Charles pretending to be Emily's cousin. Miss Marple stays at Sittaford House and quietly absorbs all the information that trickles back to her, which is surprising in that this tends to be much more characteristic of book Miss Marple than film Miss Marple. In fact, come to think of it, the book version of Miss Percehouse is very Miss Marple-esque. Anyway, unlike the book, circumstances are such that this has become a closed-circle mystery, meaning that the suspects are limited to a fixed number of people. In this case, Kirkwood says he locked the hotel when everyone went to bed, so the murderer must be someone who was there at that time. James doesn't take well to being a suspect, so he's locked up. As in the book, Emily vows to prove him innocent, but it doesn't really carry the same kind of weight. One by one, the suspects reveal their secrets, deep, dark, or otherwise. In Violet's case, it turns out she was married to Trevelyan, so she inherits everything. On his stakeout, Charles spots Mrs. Willett making off with the hotel chef, who turns out to be the escaped convict, and also Mr. Kirkwood's cousin, but they don't get far. Miss Marple confronts the person who sent the poisoned candy, Miss Percehouse, who fills in Miss Marple on Trevelyan's Egypt backstory, including a love affair that resulted in an illegitimate son. Bond, James Bond. Finally, Emily discovers the boots in the chimney, but before she can draw any conclusions, James is discovered with a bloody knife in his hand next to a second murder victim. The police get through and arrest Jim, and Emily seeks consolation with Charles, with whom she's begun to fall in love. So we've reached that part of the video where if you want to read the book or watch the film unspoiled, here's where you need to stop watching. Charles Enderby joins Major Burnaby and the Willets for a second séance, where they hope a spirit will tell them the name of the murderer. It's unclear whether this is meant to be some sort of prearranged trap, but if it is, it seems to be pointless, because before anything happens, Emily and the inspector burst in and arrest Major Burnaby. It turns out Burnaby learned ahead of time that he was going to be awarded £5,000 for a contest that Trevelyan entered in Burnaby's name, something he did quite frequently. Burnaby wanted Trevelyan dead so he could keep the money. Miss Percehouse mentions that throughout their friendship, Trevelyan was always the winner and Burnaby was always the loser, so the resentment had built up over time. But how did he do it? Well, in fact, Burnaby faked the spirit message and used it to establish a false alibi. At the time of the séance, Trevelyan was still alive, but then Burnaby went down to Exhampton not on foot, but on skis, hence the ski boots Emily found hidden, and killed him. Then he waited a couple hours before pretending to arrive after the long walk. Charles wastes no time in asking Emily to marry him, but to his surprise, she's still in love with her fiancé, James. She reflects that she'd rather have a man who's dependent on her than the other way around. Charles gets over it pretty quickly. In the film... Are you ready? Because I wasn't prepared for this. In the film, the murderer is revealed to be Burnaby. Charles Burnaby. Is that why they switched names? Charles is not a journalist at all, but the illegitimate son whom Trevelyan abandoned in Egypt along with his mother, for which Charles wanted revenge. He faked an alibi the same way the Major did in the book, by skiing to Exhampton, killing Trevelyan, and then pretending to arrive much later. Kirkwood had lied about locking up the hotel because he didn't want anyone to know he'd left the cellar door unlocked for his cousin, the convict. The second victim was a would-be blackmailer. Emily tries to apprehend Charles, but he kills himself. James, like Charles in the book, assumes he'll now get to marry Emily, but she tells him she's changed her mind.
Well, I've made other plans. We both have, and they don't involve men, sadly.
Miss Marple consoles Major Enderby, and she leaves Sittaford House, which is apparently now haunted by Trevelyan's ghost. So, good for him? Don't get me wrong, I actually really like this adaptation. There are others where they change the murderer, and they're complete crap. But that brings us back to the question, is this film really an adaptation? Or is it an adaptation in name only? Well, by now you probably know my answer. No, it's not an adaptation. It's a story that happens to share names and events with its source material, just like the recent film Death on the Nile. But the reasons for that might not be what you think. True, the screenwriter made drastic changes, but even if, say, the murderer had stayed the same character, it still wouldn't have been an adaptation. Murder Most Foul made way more changes, and it still counts as an adaptation. Why? A private investigator goes undercover in order to save an innocent man from being executed for a crime he didn't commit. Despite being nearly murdered, the hero exposes the true killer who committed murder to preserve their privilege. This description can be applied to both versions of the story, so they both share the same theme of risking one's life for the sake of justice. On the other hand, a young woman's love for her fiancé is tested and proven true as she strives to exonerate him for a crime he didn't commit, is a synopsis that could describe the book, but not the film. The novel version focuses on village life and gossip, some of which is completely erroneous and some of which is surprisingly accurate, and Emily impresses everyone with her intelligence, tenacity, and great strength of character. But every now and then we glimpse her softer side, her fear and anguish at the thought of what she has to lose. But in the film, all this is replaced as the focus is shifted almost entirely onto Captain Trevelyan. The theme becomes something like, justice will always catch up with you. Ironically, there is a theory put forth in the book about Trevelyan abandoning a lover from long ago. Come to think of it, the solution to this mystery is very similar to another Agatha Christie novel. We'll talk about that some other time. The point is, the Miss Marple version of the Sittaford Mystery might contain some of the same mechanics as its source material, but plot mechanics are not enough to make it the same story. Otherwise, every other episode of Death in Paradise would be a Christie adaptation. Well, that's my take on it. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Leave a comment. I'm not sure what Agatha Christie book-to-film comparison to do next, so I'll happily receive suggestions. Until next time.
Adios.